World War II ended on September 2nd, 1945. Japan surrendered, the emperor spoke on the radio, and soldiers everywhere laid down their weapons. Except for one guy on a remote Philippine island, who said, "Nah, I'm good," and kept fighting for another 29 years. Onoda's mission. Hiru. Onoda wasn't some random infantry grunt who got left behind. He was an intelligence officer trained at the Nakano School, Japan's elite spy academy that taught guerrilla warfare, sabotage, and how to survive behind enemy lines indefinitely. In December 1944, he got deployed to Lubang Island in the Philippines with explicit orders from his commander, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. The orders were simple conduct guerrilla operation. Don't surrender, don't commit suicide, and wait for the Imperial Army to return. Taniguchi told him it might take 3 years, maybe 5, but they'd come back. Onoda believed him. He'd follow those orders for the next 3 decades. But the real question isn't why he stayed so long. It's why it took such a specific thing to get him out. When the Allies invaded Lubang in February 1945, most of the Japanese garrison either died in combat or surrendered. Onoda and 3 other soldiers, Yuichi Akatsu, Shoichi Shimada, and Kinshichi Kozuka, escaped into the mountains and started their guerrilla campaign. They burned rice fields to deny resources to the enemy, stole food from local farms, and set up camps deep in the jungle where nobody could find them. The problem? The enemy had already won and gone home. But Onoda's group wouldn't figure that out for years, and when they did, some of them still wouldn't leave. The locals trying to farm their land weren't Allied soldiers. They were just Filipino civilians trying to live their lives. Over the years, Onoda's group got smaller. Akatsu surrendered in 1950 after 6 months of starvation and loneliness broke him. Shimada got shot and killed by a search party in 1954. That left Onoda and Kozuka, and they kept going for another 18 years. They adapted, learned the island's terrain like a video game map, and avoided capture by moving camps constantly. In 1965, they even found a transistor radio and listened to broadcasts about Japan's economic boom, the Tokyo Olympics, and the Beatles. Most people would have realized something was up. Onoda didn't. And the reason why reveals something darker about his training. But Onoda dismissed it all as elaborate propaganda. He figured if the Allies could fake surrender leaflets, they could fake radio shows too. Kozuka's end. By 1972, it was just Onoda and Kozuka, 2 guys in their 50s still playing guerrilla soldier on an island that had moved on decades ago. On October 19th, they were raiding a rice field when they ran into a Philippine police patrol. Shots got fired, and Kozuka took a bullet to the chest. He died on the spot. Onoda escaped back into the jungle, and for the first time in 27 years, he was completely alone. You'd think that would break him. It didn't, because what happened next proved Onoda wasn't fighting for Japan anymore. He was fighting for something else entirely. No companion, no backup, just him and his rifle, and the belief that he was still at war. The Philippine government and Japanese search teams ramped up efforts to find him. They dropped leaflets, sent loudspeakers into the jungle playing messages from his family, and even flew in his siblings to call out to him. Onoda ignored all of it. He'd been conditioned to expect psychological warfare, and this fit the profile perfectly. In his mind, the enemy was getting desperate, which meant Japan must be winning somewhere. So what finally worked? Not logic, not family, something way stranger. He just had to hold out a little longer. What finally changed everything was a 24-year-old Japanese college dropout named Norio Suzuki. Suzuki had this wild bucket list: find a panda, find a yeti, and find Hiru Onoda. In February 1974, he traveled to Lubang with a backpack and 0 official backing, just wandering the jungle hoping to stumble across a legend, and somehow he did. But Suzuki couldn't get Onoda to surrender. Nobody could, except one person, and tracking him down was almost as hard as finding Onoda. He found Onoda's camp, walked up, and started talking. Onoda didn't shoot him because Suzuki wasn't threatening. He was just this goofy kid asking questions. The surrender. Suzuki told Onoda the war had been over for 29 years. Onoda didn't buy it. He said he'd only surrender if his commanding officer personally relieved him of duty. So Suzuki went back to Japan, tracked down Major Taniguchi, who was now an old man running a bookstore, and convinced him to fly to the Philippines. On March 9th, 1974, Taniguchi hiked into the jungle in his old uniform and gave Onoda the order. The war is over. The order is rescinded. Onoda saluted, handed over his rifle still in perfect working condition with 500 rounds, and walked out of the jungle after 29 years. Japan called him a hero. The Philippines called him something very different. And what they called him explains why his story gets so complicated. When he got back to Japan, he was a national hero. Crowds cheered, the media swarmed him, and people called him the embodiment of loyalty and duty. But in the Philippines, the reaction was different. Onoda's group had killed around 30 people during their holdout, most of them civilians just trying to farm or fish. To the locals, he wasn't a hero. He was a guy who spent 3 decades terrorizing their island because he refused to accept reality. President Ferdinand Marcos pardoned him to avoid an international incident. but the resentment stayed. But here's what nobody talks about. Onoda wasn't even the most extreme case. There was someone who stayed hidden longer, knew the war was over, and still refused to come out. Onoda struggled to adjust to modern Japan. The country he left in 1944 was militaristic, desperate, and at war. The country he returned to in 1974 had bullet trains, skyscrapers, and a booming economy. He couldn't handle it. In 1975, he moved to Brazil and became a cattle rancher. He later returned to Japan in the 1980s and started a nature school for kids, trying to teach them survival skills and discipline. He wrote a memoir called No Surrender: My 30-Year War, which became a bestseller. He died in 2014 at age 91, still defending his actions as following orders. Yokoi's shame. Onoda wasn't even the last holdout to surrender. That honor goes to Teruo Nakamura, who came out of the Indonesian jungle in December 1974. But before him, there was Shoichi Yokoi, a tailor-turned-soldier who spent 27 years hiding on Guam. Yokoi's story is different because he wasn't fighting. He was hiding, and the reason he stayed hidden had nothing to do with believing the war was still on. He knew it was over. So why stay? The answer reveals the one thing Japanese soldiers feared more than death. He just couldn't face going home. Yokoi got drafted in 1941 and sent to Guam as part of the garrison defending the island. When the Americans invaded in 1944, most of the Japanese forces got killed or captured. Yokoi and a few others escaped into the jungle and went into survival mode. Over the years, his companions died or surrendered, and by 1964, Yokoi was alone. He dug a cave into a riverbank, reinforced it with bamboo, and lived there for 8 years in total isolation. He survived on frogs, rats, snails, and whatever plants he could for it. He made clothes from tree bark because his uniform had rotted away decades ago. The wild part is, Yokoi knew the war had ended. He'd seen American planes, heard English-speaking tourists, and found discarded newspapers. But Japanese military culture had drilled into him that surrender was the ultimate disgrace. He couldn't face the shame of going home defeated, so he stayed in his cave, alone, convincing himself that dying in the jungle was better than living as a failure. When they finally dragged him out in 1972, his first words explained everything, and they made him more famous than Onoda. In January 1972, 2 local hunters checking their shrimp traps stumbled across him. He tried to fight them off, but was too weak. They dragged him out, and he became the second to last Japanese holdout to surrender. Different reaction. When Yokoi returned to Japan, his first words were, "It is with much embarrassment that I return." The Japanese public loved him for his humility. He became a celebrity, appeared on talk shows, wrote books, and spent the rest of his life advocating for simple living and traditional values. He even got married at age 57 to a woman who admired his survival skills. He died in 1997, having spent more time as a celebrity than he ever did as a soldier. But there was still one guy left out there, and his story is the strangest of all because he wasn't even supposed to be Japanese. But Yokoi's story raises a question. If he knew the war was over, why didn't he just come out earlier? The answer is cultural. Japan's pre-war education system taught soldiers that their lives belonged to the emperor. Capture was worse than death because it dishonored not just you, but your entire family. Soldiers were told that Americans would torture and kill prisoners, so better to die fighting. That mindset didn't just vanish when the war ended. It stuck with guys like Yokoi for decades, even when logic said they should come out. Onoda had the opposite problem. He genuinely believed the war was still happening. His intelligence training taught him to distrust enemy propaganda, and every piece of evidence that the war had ended looked like a trick. Leaflets could be faked. Radio broadcasts could be staged. Even his family's voices on loudspeakers could be recorded under duress. The only thing he'd accept was a direct order from his superior officer, and that's exactly what it took to get him out. Nakamura's isolation. Teruo. Nakamura holds the record as the absolute last Japanese holdout. He surrendered on Morotai Island in Indonesia on December 18, 1974, just 3 months after Onoda. But Nakamura's story is even stranger because he wasn't ethnically Japanese. He was Taiwanese from the Amis indigenous group, conscripted into the Japanese army during the war, when Taiwan was still a Japanese colony. His real name was Atsun Palalin, but the Japanese military gave him the name Teruo Nakamura. Nakamura got sent to Morotai in 1944 as part of a garrison that got bypassed when the Allies moved on. When the war ended, most of the soldiers either surrendered or died trying to survive. Nakamura didn't surrender, but he also didn't fight. He just lived. He built a hut in the jungle, started a small farm, and survived on taro, coconut, and whatever else he could grow or catch. He wasn't conducting guerrilla warfare. He was basically a hermit farmer who happened to still be wearing bits of his old uniform. An Indonesian Air Force pilot spotted him during a routine patrol in 1974, and authorities sent a team to investigate. When they found him, Nakamura didn't resist. He just seemed confused about why everyone was making such a big deal. No heroes welcome, no parades, because technically, he wasn't even their soldier anymore. Which raises the question how many others were out there that nobody was looking for? Unlike Onoda and Yokoi, he didn't get a hero's welcome. Japan didn't even consider him a citizen anymore, because Taiwan had stopped being a Japanese colony in 1945. He got a small pension and returned to Taiwan, where he lived quietly until his death in 1979. Group holdouts. The early post-war years had dozens of group holdouts, not just individual. On Saipan in 1945, Captain Sakai Oba led 46 soldiers in guerrilla operations for 16 months after the island fell. They raided U.S. supply depots, ambushed patrols, and survived by moving camps constantly. Oba finally surrendered in December 1945 after a Japanese admiral flew in and personally ordered him to stand down. His group walked out together, still in formation, treating it like a formal military withdrawal. That was 1945. But the group holdouts got weirder. Some didn't even know who they were fighting for anymore. On Peleliu in March 1947, Lieutenant A. Yamaguchi led 33 soldiers in an attack on a U.S. Marine patrol. They threw grenades, fired rifles, and genuinely thought they were still fighting the war. After the attack, the Americans brought in a Japanese admiral to negotiate. Yamaguchi and his men surrendered in April 1947, 2 full years after the war ended. When they came out, they were shocked to learn Japan had lost. In the Philippines, over 200 soldiers surrendered on Mindanao in 1948, 3 years after the official end. Some had been living in the jungle, others had integrated with local villages, and even married Filipino women. A few knew the war was over, but stayed because they'd built new lives and didn't want to face the shame of going home. Japan had holdouts everywhere, but China's situation was completely different, and what happened there proved some soldiers weren't hiding. They were trapped, or so they claimed. Sometimes it was about fear, shame, or just not knowing what else to do. China's holdouts. China had the weirdest holdout situation because it wasn't about denial. It was about being trapped. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, there were around 10 to 20,000 Japanese soldiers stuck in Manchuria because the Soviet Union had just invaded and the Chinese Civil War was heating up. These guys knew the war was over, but they couldn't get home. Some got captured by the Soviets and sent to labor camps in Siberia. Others got recruited by Chinese communist forces who needed experienced soldiers. A few hundred Japanese soldiers ended up fighting for the communists during the Chinese Civil War, not because they supported communism, but because it was the only way to survive. They trained Chinese troops, helped with logistics, and some even fought in battles against nationalist forces. By 1948, most had either been repatriated to Japan or died in combat, but a handful stayed in China by choice, married local women, and lived out their lives as Chinese citizens, which means the line between holdout and defector got blurry. Some soldiers weren't waiting for orders. They'd found new wars to fight, and in 1989, 2 of them were still fighting. This pattern repeated in Southeast Asia. In Malaya and Thailand, some Japanese soldiers joined communist insurgencies in the 1940s and 50s, fighting against British and Thai forces. In 1989, 2 former Japanese soldiers, Nakamura Teruo and Matsumoto Mitsuji, were discovered living with communist guerrillas in northern Thailand. They'd been there since 1945, not as holdouts, but as defectors who'd chosen to stay. When reporters asked why, they said they believed in the cause. The war had ended, but they'd found a new one. If you enjoyed this video and want to see every major WW2 battle ranked, click the video on the screen.